November 1975. New York City. A woman receives the November issue of Esquire magazine. She opens it to the marked page. She reads, and she never speaks again to the man who wrote those words. That man was Truman Capote, the most brilliant writer of his generation, the man who had turned true crime into literature within cold blood, who had invented Holly Golightly and the entire universe of Breakfast at Tiffany's, who had filled the Plaza Hotel with 500 guests dressed in black and white at what the press called the party of the century. The most witty, most cruel, and most adored man at any table in any city in the Western world for more than 2 decades. And beyond all of that, the only true confidant that woman had ever had. The only one who knew everything. Absolutely everything. The woman was Babe Paley. Babe, to everyone who knew her. Considered for decades the most elegant woman in America. The most photographed, the most imitated, the one who appeared on covers, and on every best-dressed list in the world. The one whose silk scarf knotted to the handle of her handbag had launched a trend that millions of women would copy for years without knowing exactly where it came from. The wife of William Paley, the founder of CBS, the man who built modern television as we know it. The hostess of the most coveted dinner parties in New York, the perfect woman, and she chose to die without forgiving him. She had 4 years of life left at that point. She had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. She knew exactly what remained. And in those 4 years, until she died on July 6, 1978, one day after her 63rd birthday, she did not answer the phone when he called. She did not respond to the letters. She did not open the door. She sent no message through any intermediary. She died surrounded by her family, in her Manhattan apartment, without having spoken a single further word to Truman Capote from that November night when she read what he had written about her. Capote was not invited to the funeral. This is the story of the perfect woman, and of the only man capable of proving that was a lie, and also the story of why that proof destroyed him just as surely as it destroyed her. To understand Babe Paley, you first have to understand her mother. Harvey Cushing was the wife of the most famous neurosurgeon in America. Dr. Harvey Cushing, professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins, Harvard and Yale. A man who, in an era when operating on the human brain was considered little short of sorcery, had transformed neurosurgery into a rigorous, documented, scientifically grounded discipline. He had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1925 for his biography of the physician William Osler. He was, in every possible sense, the kind of man whose name opened doors. He had money, he had prestige, he had connections at the most important universities in the country, and he had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. The 3 girls were Minnie, Betsy, and Barbara, the youngest of all. The one who, being her father's favorite from the moment she opened her eyes, earned forever the nickname that would follow her through life and ultimately become more real than her given name, Babe. Harvey Cushing, the mother, understood the world with a clarity that few people dared to articulate out loud, but that the entire American high society of the 1920s and 1930s understood perfectly. In that world, at that historical moment, a well-born woman had exactly one tool of power available to her: marriage, not as romantic sentiment, but as a strategic position, as a lever for accessing a world that would otherwise remain closed, as a mechanism for translating elegance and beauty into real and lasting influence. Catherine knew this with the certainty of someone who had observed the system from the inside for decades, and she raised her 3 daughters to execute that strategy with the same precision and discipline with which her husband operated on brains. It was not cynicism, or not only cynicism, it was also the only way to move through that system without being crushed by it. And the Cushing women executed it with an efficiency that would have made any Wall Street CEO pale. Minnie married Vincent Astor, heir to one of the oldest and most consolidated fortunes in America. Betsy married James Roosevelt, son of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the most powerful man in the Western world at the time. The newspapers called them the fabulous Cushing sisters, and the nickname stuck because it was accurate. 3 women who in a single generation had taken the surname of a surgeon, however brilliant, and converted it into access to the most powerful families in America. Society watched them as though they were part of something larger than themselves. And Babe was the youngest, the most observed, the one who carried on her shoulders the entire accumulated weight of expectation that her sisters had built. But before the future arrived, the accident arrived. In the early months of 1934, Babe Cushing was returning by car from a party on Long Island with her companion when the vehicle crashed. She was 19 years old. The force of the impact knocked out her front teeth and left her face covered in contusions, discoloration, and scars. Lawrence Lima, the biographer who years later would write Capote's Women, the book that inspired Ryan Murphy's FX television series Feud, describes her in those days as a mass of bruises, blotches, and scars. For weeks, she walked through Boston with a chiffon gauze scarf covering the lower half of her face, hiding what reconstructive surgery had not yet finished repairing. When visitors came, she covered herself. When she went out, she covered herself. The gauze scarf became her second skin that winter and spring. When she healed, something strange had occurred that no one in the family had anticipated. Her false teeth had given her a smile, more perfect than the one she had before the accident. The surgery had reconstructed her features with a precision that nature would never have achieved on its own. Babe Cushing emerged from the accident technically more beautiful than when she entered it. Lima writes that she came out flawless, and perhaps more beautiful still. But what no one knew then, what Babe never told anyone until much later, was that during those weeks beneath the gauze scarf, staring in the mirror at a face she did not recognize as her own, she had learned the most important lesson of her life, the lesson that explains everything. Perfection is not natural. Perfection is constructed, and once constructed, it must be defended every day, every hour, every time someone looks at you. Because the moment you let your guard down, the accident of 1934 returns, in one form or another, to remind you that underneath all of it, you are a mass of bruises and scars, covered with a gauze scarf. That lesson lasted her 44 years, until the night Truman Capote destroyed it, with 11,000 words published in a glossy magazine with a circulation of 1 million copies. In October 1934, the same year as the accident, Babe was formally introduced to society as a debutante in Boston. Several of President Roosevelt's sons attended, as he was the brother-in-law of her sister Betsy. Her debut attracted the attention of half the city in the middle of the Great Depression. That a family would spend so much on a ball when the rest of the country was standing in food lines was in itself a declaration of power. Society took note. The newspaper columns mentioned her. The photographers sought her out. At 19, Babe Cushing was already a name. The following year she moved to New York, where her sisters had already established their positions. She worked in various fashion industry jobs before arriving, in 1938, at Vogue as a fashion editor. Her position at the magazine gave her access to the great designer's clothes, typically lent in exchange for visibility and the image generated by Babe Cushing wearing your creations, which turned her into a living laboratory of style. She learned to mix extraordinarily expensive jewels by Fulco di Verdura and Jean Schlumberger with inexpensive costume pieces. To let her hair go silver instead of dyeing it at a time when that was publicly equivalent to surrendering. To make pantsuits elegant, long before anyone considered it possible. In 1941, Time magazine named her the second best-dressed woman in the world, second only to Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. Babe Cushing was 26 years old. The machinery of perfection was operating at full power, and once in motion, it did not stop. The first marriage came in 1940. Stanley Grafton Mortimer Jr. was an oil heir, grandson of one of the founders of Standard Oil. Attractive, well-bred, and exactly the type Catherine Cushing had envisioned for her youngest daughter. The wedding was held in September of that year at the Episcopal Church in East Hampton, New York. There were photographs in the newspapers. There were mentions in the society columns. Everything was in its place. They had 2 children, Stanley Grafton Mortimer III and Amanda J. Mortimer, who would later become Amanda Burden, one of the most influential figures in New York urban planning of the 1970s and 1980s, director of city planning under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. The daughter of a failed marriage who built something entirely her own. But that would come later. First came the war, and the war did what the war does. It turned Stanley Mortimer into a different man. His time in the Navy left him bitter, struggling with alcohol, unable to return to the person he had been before the ships and the combat and the months at sea far from everything he knew. According to people close to the marriage, he became consistently difficult and volatile. In 1946, Babe filed for divorce. She received a settlement based on a trust fund for the children's maintenance. The small but sufficient scandal became fuel for the gossip columns of New York high society. But Babe already had her eyes fixed elsewhere. William Samuel Paley was, in 1946, the man who had built CBS from a small radio network into the largest and most powerful media empire in America. He had been born in 1901 in the Jewish neighborhood of Chicago's West Side, the son of Ukrainian immigrants who manufactured cigars. When his father Samuel moved the business to Philadelphia and became a millionaire, William was 12 years old and had already made a decision that portrays him better than any biography. He added the initial S to his name. It didn't correspond to any real name. He admitted himself decades later with complete nonchalance. It simply sounded better. It simply felt more like what he wanted to be. That instinct to become something more than chance had assigned him at birth would accompany him his entire life. At 26, he was named president of CBS. In the years that followed, he recruited Jack Benny, Bing Crosby, George Burns, and Gracie Allen, poaching them from other networks, built the advertising business model for radio and then television that still governs modern media, and turned CBS into the most important network in America, with programs ranging from the Beverly Hillbillies to 60 Minutes, from All in the Family to the first live broadcast of the Second World War. By 1946, Bill Paley had real power, real money, and art collections that rivaled public museums. He had a 7-foot Picasso hanging in the foyer of his apartment. He had connections in Washington, in Hollywood, in the European capitals. But he had a problem that money could not solve directly, one that irritated him in a way that people who knew him well were quick to identify. His Jewish heritage excluded him from the Long Island country clubs that were the social center of gravity of the world he wanted to inhabit. Despite all his wealth, despite all his power in media, the silent but absolutely effective anti-Semitism of Anglo-Saxon high society kept him outside certain doors, and Bill Paley, who had added an invented initial to his name at age 12 to sound like more than he was, could not tolerate any closed door. He needed someone like Babe Cushing, a Boston wasp, daughter of a Johns Hopkins and Harvard academic, sister of Roosevelt's sister-in-law, Depression-era debutante, Vogue editor, second best-dressed woman in the world, according to Time. Babe was exactly what Bill needed in the social space, where money alone was not sufficient. And Babe Cushing needed someone like Bill Paley. Her first marriage had ended. She had 2 children. The trust fund from the divorce settlement gave her a certain comfort, but not the kind of life for which her mother had prepared her. Not the scale, not the permanence, not the real weight. Lawrence Lima, the biographer who interviewed dozens of people close to both of them for Capote's Women, describes it with a precision that neither of them would ever have used aloud, but that everyone who knew them understood perfectly. Babe gave Bill access to haute société and refined taste, and Bill gave Babe the money to live as she and her mother had always believed she was born to live. His generosity toward her was not altruism. It was a smart investment in her ability to play the role for which he had hired her. That role was Mrs. William S. Paley, perfect wife of the founder of CBS, unrivaled hostess, emblem of everything money can buy when it knows exactly how to spend itself. They married on July 28, 1947, in Manhasset, Nassau County, New York. The ceremony took place 4 days after Bill's divorce from his first wife, Dorothy Hart Hearst, was finalized. High society noted the interval. Dorothy, who described Bill as cold as ice, left the city for a time. The Paleys installed themselves in a luxury apartment at the Hotel St. Regis, decorated by interior designer Billy Baldwin, with printed cotton walls and a pink and salmon color scheme designed specifically so that the skin of its occupants would glow under any light. On weekends they moved to Kelowna Farm, 80 acres in Manhasset, Long Island, where a succession of architects and garden designers had turned the estate into something that looked lifted from the centerfold of a magazine about perfect living. They had 2 more children together, William C. Paley and Kate Cushing Paley. The exterior life was exactly what it needed to be. Babe was named to the best-dressed list 14 times over the following decades. She was inducted into the Fashion Hall of Fame in 1958. She purchased entire collections from Givenchy and Valentino. A photograph of her with a silk scarf knotted to the handle of her handbag launched a trend that millions of women around the world imitated for years. She made pantsuits elegant before anyone thought it possible. She allowed her hair to silver at a time when social convention demanded concealing one's age. Designer Bill Blass, who knew her for decades, left in writing something that captures her better than any more elaborate description. He never saw her go unnoticed. That what you noticed was Babe herself, not what she was wearing. That she illuminated the clothes. The clothes did not illuminate her. Writer Oscar de la Renta expressed it differently. Whatever she wore it in a way you would never forget. The exterior life was perfect, as it had always been perfect, as it would always have to be perfect. But there is a fundamental difference between building a perfect life and living inside one. And that difference was exactly what Babe never told anyone. Except Truman. Bill Paley was a genius. That is beyond dispute. He built CBS from nothing, from his father's Cuban cigars, and an instinct for understanding what the American public wanted to hear, and then see before the American public knew it wanted it. He invented the radio advertising business model that still governs modern media. He was one of the most important art collectors of the 20th century, whose donation to the Museum of Modern Art includes masterworks by Matisse, Cézanne, Gauguin, and Picasso that still hang in the museum's most visited galleries today. In 2022, when MoMA auctioned part of the Paley collection at Sotheby's, it obtained more than $83 million. When Bill died in 1990, among those who spoke at his funeral were David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Walter Cronkite. The New York Times described him in his obituary as a 20th century visionary with the ambitions of a 19th century robber baron. And he was, in the words of one of his closest friends, whose name biographers have recorded without ambiguity, not a lover of women, but a womanizer. Theatre producer Irene Selznick, who was a friend of Bill's for more than 6 decades, described him with a perfectly calibrated mixture of affection and exasperation that is worth more than any other description. He always had a roving eye and a roving hand. His first marriage had ended when a newspaper published the suicide note a former girlfriend had written him. He maintained a full year-long affair with silent film star Louise Brooks, known throughout America as the it girl of 1920s Hollywood, whom he continued to support financially for the rest of her life, long after the relationship ended. With Babe, the pattern took a specific, systematic, and particularly cruel form in its details. The type of woman Bill sought outside the marriage was the exact opposite of his wife in every visible quality. Voluptuous, blonde, in the style of Marilyn Monroe, the precise antithesis of the contained elegance Babe embodied. He found them in bars and clubs. He traveled to Hollywood on business trips that everyone in his immediate circle knew was something else entirely. The journalist and family friend who describes the situation most frankly in the available record states that Bill Paley was merciless with his wife, demanding she be absolutely perfect in every public appearance, while privately criticizing her every time her guard slipped, and simultaneously betraying her with women who shared none of the values he demanded of her. The consequences for Babe were profound and sustained. Biographers and people close to her document that she began to believe she was not attractive, that there was something fundamentally defective in her that no Givenchy gown could correct. She smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. She maintained a gold notebook, a detail biographers mention repeatedly as an emblem of everything that was wrong with that marriage, in which she recorded every criticism Bill made of her appearance, her behavior, her manner of existing. According to people very close to her, at some point during the hardest years of the marriage, she attempted to end her life on more than one occasion. To survive within all of that, Babe built her own parallel system. What she called her men who make her laugh, witty, urbane men, most of them entirely platonic, with whom she practiced the conversation and charm and lightness that Bill never provided. Men who looked at her and saw Babe, not Mrs. Paley. Men who made her feel that the person beneath all the apparatus of perfection had value of her own, and not merely instrumental value. Biographers also document at least 2 affairs in the 1960s, one with an American ambassador that lasted several months, and another with a banker that became serious enough for Babe to consider, for the first and only time, the real possibility of divorcing Bill. Both relationships ended, and Babe remained Mrs. Paley, and remained more unhappy than before. Lawrence Leamer writes something about her social life that defines the entire architecture of her existence and explains everything that follows. Babe had no friends in the conventional sense of the term because trust was too risky. Any confidence could be used against her or against her husband. Any weakness shown in the wrong context could become a weapon. Babe had learned that lesson in Boston from her mother before the accident arrived, and the accident had confirmed it, that beneath the visible perfection there was something vulnerable that had to be protected with constant, unaccepted vigilance. Any confidence could be used against her, except the one she shared with Truman. The meeting between Babe Paley and Truman Capote began with a misunderstanding that both of them would cite as one of their favorite stories for decades afterward. A mutual friend asked the Paleys if he could bring Truman along on one of their vacations. The Paleys agreed, convinced they were being introduced to President Harry Truman, who was a known figure in their circle. When there arrived that small man, 5'4", with a high-pitched voice, a cherubic adult face, a talent for conversation that literally took your breath away, and the ability to make anyone laugh in the first sentence, the confusion became apparent, and yet no one sent him back. Truman Capote had at this point a biography that would have made any novel he might have written pale by comparison. Born in 1924 in New Orleans under the name Truman Streckfus Persons, son of an itinerant insurance salesman and a young and beautiful woman with no interest whatsoever in raising anyone. His parents left him in the care of distant relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, where he grew up in a house without luxury, but with a peculiar freedom that shaped his writer's eye. He published his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, at 23, and the photograph that appeared on the back cover, him reclining on a sofa with an expression somewhere between defiant and seductive, became by itself a national sensation and scandal. He was openly gay at a time when homosexuality was still illegal in most of the United States. He knew Marilyn Monroe, who called him her best friend. He knew Jackie Kennedy. Norman Mailer said of him in 1984, the year of his death, the phrase that summarizes him better than any other: his talent was his friend, his achievement was his social life, and within the perfectly calibrated social system of New York high society, Truman Capote occupied the most structurally useful position that could exist: the witty, brilliant, absolutely unthreatening gay companion who could attend any dinner, make any hostess laugh, entertain any bored husband, and threaten no one. He was the kind of man that a woman like Babe could allow into the absolute center of her life without anyone on the outside raising an eyebrow. And he knew it, and he used it, and at the same time, he felt it completely. Capote had a name for the small group of women who made up his innermost circle. He called them his swans: Babe Paley, Slim Keith, who had been married to Leland Hayward and would later marry Lord Keith; C.Z. Guest, the Boston Brahmin blonde who was the first winner of the Fashion Icon Award from the American Designers Council; Marella Agnelli, the wife of the president of Fiat; Gloria Guinness, the Mexican heiress; Lee Radziwill, Jackie Kennedy's younger sister. There are certain women, Capote wrote, who, though they may not have been born rich, were born to be rich. His swans embodied that with a precision he found hypnotic. They were beautiful, elegant, wealthy, and possessed a social brilliance that made them magnetic in any room they entered. He collected them the way others collected art. He studied them, he listened to them, he learned from them. And with Babe, it was different from everything else. Capote said it in different forms, at different moments to different people, with the consistency of someone telling the truth. She was one of the 2 or 3 great obsessions of my life, he said. She was the only person in my entire life about whom I liked absolutely everything. I was madly in love with her. Australian actress Naomi Watts, who portrayed Babe in the FX series Feud, Capote versus the Swans, Ryan Murphy's project that in 2024 returned the story of the Swans to the center of American cultural conversation, summarized it with a clarity that Babe herself would never have articulated aloud, but that everyone who knew her would recognize as exact. Babe's relationship with Capote was the deepest romance she ever lived. Without sex, Babe gave herself to that man and to all her secrets, and Babe told him exactly that. Everything. Bill's infidelities, the details, the names when she knew them, the circumstances, the humiliations, the gold notebook where she recorded the criticisms, the suicide attempts, the systematic loneliness inside a life that everyone on the outside envied with an intensity Babe would have found absurd if anyone could have seen what lay behind the perfect dinners and the perfect dresses and the perfect decor of Kiluna Farm. She told him about the fear of aging, about the certainty that without Bill's money, she would not exist as an individual in the world, that her entire identity was built on that foundation, and that if the foundation trembled, everything trembled. About the way her marriage was an employment contract with a built-in silence clause and penalties that no lawyer had written, but that both of them knew perfectly. Capote listened. He consoled her. He made Babe laugh at the darkest things, because he had that talent, and because he understood that sometimes laughing at the abyss is the only way to keep from falling into it. And according to Lawrence Lima, when Babe described in detail one of the most humiliating episodes of Bill's infidelities, Capote advised her to stay, to see it for what it was, the best job in the world, to accept the terms and be happy within what that job could offer. That advice, with all its brutal honesty, is the key to the betrayal that would follow, because Capote knew exactly what that job consisted of, exactly what the terms were, exactly what Babe was being paid, and exactly what she was paying. He knew everything with a precision that no other human being in Babe's life possessed. And what he knew, eventually, he wrote. Writer Gerald Clark, Capote's biographer and personal friend for years, read the chapters of Answered Prayers, while Capote floated in a pool on a rubber raft, glass in hand, with the satisfaction of someone who believes he has written something great. Clark told him, choosing his words carefully, "People are not going to be happy with this, Truman." Capote replied without flinching, "Oh, they're too stupid. They won't know who they are." He could not have been more wrong at any point in his life. When someone tells you that no one will recognize themselves in what you've written, what they are actually telling you is that they know perfectly well that everyone will. Capote was not stupid. He was exactly the opposite. And that makes what he did even more difficult to understand, and at the same time, completely inevitable. In 1966, the same year he organized the black and white ball in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York, the party the newspapers called the Party of the Century, which gathered in a single night Lauren Bacall, Frank Sinatra, Mia Farrow, Princess Lee Radziwill, Norman Mailer, Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham, and 500 other people representing the full spectrum of cultural, political, and financial power in 1960s America. Truman Capote signed a contract with Random House for a novel called Answered Prayers. It was going to be his masterpiece, the novel that would place him definitively in the pantheon of the great American writers of the 20th century. He received an advance of $25,000. The delivery date was January 1st, 1968. That deadline was not met, nor the next, nor the 4 after that. Over more than a decade, Random House revised the contract 4 additional times, each time with more money on the table and increasingly generous deadlines. The financial offer grew until it reached $1 million for a completed novel in 1981. The novel was never completed. What remained of it was published posthumously in 1987 under the title Answered Prayers, the unfinished novel, 400 pages of a book that should have been twice as long. In June 1975, with the novel still unfinished and the pressure from Random House mounting, Capote published the first chapter in Esquire as a pre-release, a text titled Mojave, a story of sexual infidelity, violence, and betrayal between fictional characters who were, to anyone who knew the Paley world, transparently Babe and Bill, with names changed and just enough fictional cover to give, Random House's lawyers, nothing to stop the publication. Researcher Kelly, Greenberg, Jeffcott, who spent more than a decade studying Capote and his swans for her novel Swan Song, describes Mojave as a fairly transparent portrait of Babe Paley and her husband. The reaction of the swans when it was published was enthusiastic, nearly unanimous praise. "Truman, you're brilliant. You're at your very best." No one took visible offense, or no one showed it. Capote interpreted that silence as approval, as a green light, as proof that he could go further. The November 1975 issue of Esquire published the second chapter, La Côte Basque, 1965, 11,000 words, set in the celebrated French restaurant on Fifth Avenue where Capote and his swans regularly lunched, the place where after-dinner conversations lasted for hours and where secrets circulated with the same natural rhythm as the wine. The narrator of the piece is called Jonesy, a barely disguised alter ego for Capote, and he sits down at a table and over the course of the lunch proceeds to disgorge, one by one, the darkest and most compromising stories of New York high society. The story of Johnny Carson, presented in the text as Bobby Baxter, the midnight clown, who from his mistress's bed calls his wife, and with a breathtaking cruelty puts the other woman on the phone so his wife can hear exactly where her husband is and with whom. The story of Anne Woodward, the actress and model who in 1955 shot and killed her husband at their Long Island estate, claiming she mistook him for an intruder, a case that had been buried for years in high society rumor and that Capote resurrected without a single word of compassion. The story of Joseph Kennedy, father of the assassinated president, explicitly accused of rape. Story after story, each with a layer of fiction thin enough that anyone who lived in that world would immediately recognize who Capote was referring to, and thick enough that Random House's lawyers found no legal basis to stop publication. And then, at the center of everything, the story of Sidney Dillon. Sidney Dillon, the conglomerateur, the extraordinarily successful businessman, the husband of the glamorous and impeccable Cleo Dillon. A couple that absolutely no one in New York high society had difficulty identifying as Bill and Babe Paley. Capote spent 11 pages delivering the detailed account of how Sidney Dillon had spent the night with a woman who was not his wife, described in the text with enough specificity that readers in the inner circle understood she could be the wife of a former governor of New York, and the character's desperate maneuvering to launder the stained sheets before his impeccable wife returned to the hotel room. The detail was not fiction invented at a desk. It was a real story that someone had told Capote in confidence, at one of those lunches at La Côte Basque, on one of those afternoons when confidences circulated as a natural part of conversation between friends who kept nothing from each other. Those 11,000 words were published in November 1975, and within 48 hours, the social world of New York was on fire. Researcher Kelly Greenberg Jeffcott described it with an image no one who has read about the episode has forgotten. The moment he published that second extract in Esquire was like detonating a bomb. Everyone turned against him. He was persona non grata. A critic of the era, whose words were recorded in several chronicles of the period, said the text was filth served on a golden plate. In perhaps the description that best captures the general reaction, a journalist covering the scandal wrote that the sacred monsters of high society had been in a state of shock for weeks. In the hours following publication, the phones of New York high society did not stop. Slim Keith convened the swans. They read the text. They identified each story, each character, each secret filtered beneath the varnish of fiction. They identified the details that could only have come from private conversations. They identified the precise moment at which Capote had converted their trust into literary material. The verdict was unanimous and admitted no exceptions. None of them would ever speak to Truman Capote again. The prohibition was not offered as a choice. It was issued as an obligation. Gloria Vanderbilt, who appeared in the text in a way that left her in an unflattering light, stated publicly that the next time she saw Truman Capote, she was going to spit in his face. Slim Keith was more categorical and more permanent. It was unfair and terrible that he put those words in my mouth. I will never forgive him, never. And she kept that promise for the rest of her life. Babe Paley read the text. She said nothing in public. She made no statements. She gave no interviews. She hung up the phone when Capote called, and she never answered it again. That was her. Revenge, absolute silence, maintained for 3 years until her death, toward the only man to whom she had entrusted absolutely everything. Capote fled New York the moment the issue went on sale, under the pretext of a small role in a Los Angeles film. But he could not escape the consequences, because the consequences were internal as much as external. According to his own later recollections, and according to people who saw him in those days, he shut himself in his apartment in the United Nations complex in Manhattan, lying in bed, weeping, repeating the same words over and over. I didn't want to do it. I thought they would come back. His goddaughter Kate Harrington, daughter of John O'Shea, one of his closest friends, said that in those days it was as though the family had suffered a death. I didn't want to do it. I thought they would come back. Those words matter, because they reveal that Capote not only knew what he had done, but had miscalculated the consequences, that he had overestimated these women's capacity to absorb the betrayal or to forgive it, that somewhere in his extraordinary intelligence there was a blind spot that prevented him from understanding that there are things from which one does not come back. There is something that makes Capote's betrayal even darker when you know the complete chronology and not just the isolated event. In 1974, 1 year before La Côte Basque 1965 was published in Esquire, Babe Paley had received her diagnosis of lung cancer. Years of smoking 2 packs a day had exacted a toll with no way back. The diagnosis was grave, and Babe knew it. It is not documented with certainty whether Capote knew about the cancer when he submitted the chapter to Esquire. But what is certain is that when Babe read those pages in November 1975, she read them knowing her time was limited, and she chose not to waste that time forgiving the person who had betrayed her in the only way that could cause her real damage, by revealing what lay beneath the perfection. With the peculiar serenity of someone who has already processed the idea of their own death, Babe began to plan her funeral with the same precision with which she had organized every dinner party at Kiluna Farm for 30 years. She chose the menu that would be served at the luncheon following the burial. She chose the wines. She wrapped her jewels in colored paper and created a complete file with detailed instructions about who should receive each piece after her death. Every object had its recipient. Every recipient had their envelope. Every envelope had its instructions. The perfect woman organizing her own disappearance with the same excellence with which she had organized everything else in her life, without exceptions, until the very end. Without his swans, Capote sank in a way that his closest friends watched with the helplessness of people witnessing an accident in slow motion, unable to do anything to stop it. The ostracism was swift and total. Ostracizing Truman became the thing to do, reported Vanity Fair in a chronicle of the following months that has been cited countless times since. Capote went from being the most sought-after guest in New York to being unwelcome at any of the tables where he had eaten for years. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations stopped arriving. The dinners he had attended his entire adult life continued without him. The world he had built through talent and charm and other people's secrets closed in on itself and left him outside. He took refuge in Studio 54, in Andy Warhol's factory, in increasing quantities of cocaine, pills, and alcohol. Esquire published 2 more chapters of Answered Prayers in 1976, but the project stalled. Capote entered and exited rehabilitation clinics throughout the years that followed. No attempt lasting long enough to make any lasting difference. C.Z. Guest, one of the few swans who did not cut him off completely, personally accompanied him to one of the detox clinics, but the drinking continued, the deterioration continued, and Answered Prayers, the novel that had destroyed him before it was finished, stayed unfinished. On July 6, 1978, Babe Paley died in her Manhattan apartment. It was 1 day after her 63rd birthday. Her family surrounded her. She had not forgiven Capote. Nearly 3 years had passed since the publication of the extract that changed everything, and in not one moment of those 3 years had Babe answered the phone when he called, or responded to a letter, or sent any message through any intermediary. Capote was not invited to the funeral. She was buried at the Memorial Cemetery of St. John's Church in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. When Bill Paley died in 1990, he was buried beside her. The man who had betrayed her year after year inside the marriage rests beside her forever. Capote, upon learning of her death, said it was like losing the most important person in his life. That she was. That did not protect her from him when he could have chosen otherwise. In the final years of his life, Truman Capote was a ruin of himself, still in possession of the wit and the pain and little else. Too drunk to write in any sustained way, too alone to live in New York with any form of dignity, too proud to apologize in a way that the people he apologized to could genuinely accept. The only friend remaining from the world he had known and destroyed was Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of Johnny Carson, whom he had also portrayed in La Côte Basque, 1965, with somewhat less cruelty than the others, and who had forgiven him nonetheless, or perhaps because of it. Joanne kept a room for him in her home in Bel Air, Los Angeles. In his final months, Capote went to live there under the pretense that he was finally going to finish Answered Prayers, that he was going to write the book he had owed the world since 1966. Joanne prepared his room, stocked the refrigerator, placed blank paper on the desk, and organized his time so he could write. Capote would sit by the pool, with a pen in one hand and a glass in the other, staring at the water. When Joanne reviewed his notebooks after his death, she found the pages were not blank. They were filled with a single sentence, repeated to the end of the notebook like a mantra, or like the record of a mind that could no longer go anywhere else. A dream, a dream, a dream, a dream that is as real as catching your foot on your own shadow. On August 25th, 1984, Joanne Carson entered the bedroom of her Bel Air home and found Truman Capote struggling to breathe. She took his pulse. It was very faint, very irregular, she would recall in various interviews over the years that followed. Capote said, "I think I'm dying." Joanne replied, "Truman, don't you dare. If you die, I'm never speaking to you again." Both of them laughed. That laugh of people who have spent years processing together things for which the ordinary world has no vocabulary. When the pulse continued to weaken, Joanne moved to call the paramedics. Capote grabbed her arm with a strength she hadn't expected. "No, no paramedics, no doctors. If you truly love me, let me go." Joanne called the paramedics anyway. When they arrived, Truman Capote was already dead. He was 59 years old. He was exactly 1 month short of 60. The official cause of death was liver disease complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. Toxicologists from Los Angeles County clarified publicly that it was not an overdose in the conventional sense. The medications found in his system were all prescribed for sleep, anxiety, leg pain, and epileptic seizures. The body had reached the end of what it could endure. "He essentially died of natural causes," said the coroner's spokesperson. The body had simply reached its limit. According to Joanne Carson, whose account of Capote's final hours has been published in multiple sources and confirmed in its main aspects, Truman Capote's last words were 3 things, in this order. He called out to his mother, who had been dead for decades. He said, "Beautiful babe," and he spoke the title of his unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. The woman who had not forgiven him had died 6 years before, and yet she was the last person in his mind. Not Bill Paley, not the jewels or the dresses, or the perfection constructed and maintained for decades at a cost no one on the outside could calculate. Babe, the real woman beneath all of it, the only one he had ever truly seen. His ashes were divided between Joanne Carson and his lifelong partner Jack Dunphy, with whom he had shared more than 3 decades, without either of them being able to fully explain the exact nature of what bound them together. Joanne's portion was auctioned in 2016, a year after her own death, as part of the general liquidation of her estate. The auction house. Julian's included it in the catalogue with some internal ambivalence, as its director later recounted, admitting that the ethical debate about whether selling someone's remains was legitimate had been real and prolonged. They proceeded because, as the director said in Variety, Truman Capote would have found it absolutely perfect that his ashes were auctioned. An anonymous buyer acquired them for $45,000. No one knows who it was. The story ended as it had lived, with a secret that nobody revealed. There is an easy way to tell this story, and there is an honest way. The easy way is to present Capote as the villain who betrayed the woman who loved him, and Babe as the victim who paid the price of having trusted someone who was not worthy of that trust. It is a clean story. It has a visible guilty party and a sympathetic victim. It can be summarized in a single sentence, and it is profoundly incomplete. The honest way is more uncomfortable, because there is no simple villain in this story. There are two people who were exactly what the world that created them asked them to be, and who paid exactly the price of being those things. Babe Paley was shaped by a system that taught her that her only real and sustainable value was visible perfection. That marriage was a power transaction disguised as love, and that lying about that transaction was part of the contract. That the only way to survive in that world was to trust no one, because trust was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Her mother knew it. She learned it, and she executed it for decades with the discipline of someone who cannot afford to get it wrong even once. Truman Capote was shaped by the same system, but from the other side and from below. He was the abandoned child who never stopped seeking the approval of people more powerful than himself. He was the genius who used his talent as a currency of access to worlds that would otherwise have excluded him as systematically as they excluded Babe Paley for being Jewish. He was the writer whose only real tool was converting other people's lives into material, something he had done since the age of 10, and that he did not know how to do otherwise, and that, in his deepest self, he did not believe he should do otherwise. His entire career had worked that way. What Babe called betrayal, Capote called art, and both of them were right. That is what makes the story impossible to resolve. What distinguishes this story from any other simple story of betrayal is that both people involved knew perfectly well the rules of the game they were playing. Babe knew that Capote was a writer who turned lives into stories, that it was his nature and his craft, and that he had never been anything else. Capote knew that Babe was confiding things she technically shouldn't be confiding, that this trust was a gift he should not misuse. Both of them chose to continue anyway, for years, because what existed between them was real, and in both of their lives, the real was scarce enough to justify the risk. Babe entrusted him with her darkest secrets because Capote was the only person who had looked at her and seen Babe, not Mrs. Paley. Not the perfect woman constructed from a 1934 accident and the expectations of a mother who understood marriage as strategy. The real woman who existed beneath all that apparatus. The girl with the gauze scarf who knew that perfection is built and that the construction never ends and that you can never lower your guard, because if you lower your guard, the accident comes back. And Capote published them because they were the most beautiful and darkest story he had. Because without those secrets, there was no novel. And without the novel, there was no Capote. Not the Capote he needed to be in order to justify everything he had sacrificed to get there. Truman Capote said of Babe Paley, a phrase that has been repeated thousands of times since, in articles and books and conversations, the most quoted line that exists about her, the one that appears most often in covers and headlines. Mrs. P had only one fault. She was perfect, otherwise she was perfect. If that line reads as a compliment, you are not paying close enough attention to what it says. It is a diagnosis. It is the clinical description of someone who has built an identity so hermetic, so complete, so without visible cracks on any of its edges, that it has no possible exit. Perfection as trap, trust as weapon, friendship as raw material, pain as argument. Babe Paley died perfect and betrayed. Truman Capote died alone and remorseful. Both of them died, saying the other's name in ways the other could not hear. Babe Paley went on living for 12 more years, and was buried beside the woman he had betrayed in ways no published book recorded, but that she had written down in a gold notebook. And the system that created all of them did not lose a single day's work. Ryan Murphy's series, Feud, Capote vs. the Swans, which premiered on FX in January 2024, returned this story to the center of American cultural conversation almost 50 years after it occurred. Naomi Watts as Babe, Tom Hollander as Capote, Diane Lane as Slim Keith, Treat Williams in his final role before his death as Bill Paley. The series received Emmy nominations and generated months of debate about what was real and what was dramatization. Babe Paley's granddaughter, Belle Burden, published an opinion piece in the New York Times criticizing certain interpretations in the series. Biographers debated in magazines and podcasts what had actually happened at those lunches and what was dramatic reconstruction. And Babe Paley, who died in 1978 believing her story was hers and no one else's, became, 46 years after her death, the character of the moment in American television. The book that inspired the series, Capote's Women, A True Story of Love, Betrayal, and a Swan Song for an Era by Lawrence Lima, published in 2021, was the first systematic attempt to document not only the answered prayer scandal, but the complete lives of the women Capote called his swans. What Lima found, interviewing family members and friends and reading archives that had remained closed for decades, was exactly what this story suggests from the beginning, that behind each of those perfect women was a life with an amount of pain and complexity that would have filled several novels, and that Capote knew it, and that he knew it because they had told him, and that he published it anyway. In the cemetery at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, there are two headstones side by side, one bearing the name Barbara Cushing Mortimer Paley, the other William S. Paley. They have lain beside each other since 1990, when Bill died and was buried where she had asked him to be buried, or where he had asked to be buried beside her, or where someone decided they should be. The details, like so many details in this story, are not completely documented. What is documented is that they are together. The man who betrayed her year after year within the marriage, and the woman who endured it for 31 years, because it was the best job in the world, according to the advice of the man who would later betray her in the only way that truly mattered. There was no winner. There were only two people who were exactly what the world asked them to be, until that was no longer enough. And the lesson that leaves, if there is one, is that perfection and betrayal are not opposites. They are companions. They always have been. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you thought Babe deserved more, or that Capote was inevitable, or that in truth they were the same thing seen from opposite sides of the same mirror, or that Bill Paley escapes this story too easily without sufficient scrutiny, leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to know how you see it. How many of you believe Capote knew exactly what he was doing? How many believe he was deceiving himself? How many believe that somewhere, deep down, Babe forgave him, but could never find the words to say so? Those conversations are what keep this story alive half a century after it happened. And if you want more stories like this one, this channel has the complete story of Lee Radziwill, who was also one of Capote's swans, and who had her own secrets and her own betrayals. The story of Jackie Kennedy, the stories of the families who built their empires on the silence of the women they loved. Subscribe. The next story is already on its way, and it is just as dark.